I can't stand seeing my ex-boyfriend getting married. We broke up a year ago because I made it clear that, although I loved him for life, I didn't want to commit. He, instead of understanding me and fighting for us, decided to go and marry someone else. It is truly exhausting to be the only person in a relationship who actually values the metaphysical depth of a connection over bureaucratic paperwork and social performance. For 3 years, Brandon and I had what most people spend their entire lives searching for, a raw, unfiltered, and intellectual bond that didn't need a government stamp to be valid. I poured my soul into that man, teaching him how to appreciate the nuances of a love that breathes on its own without the suffocation of traditional expectations. We were the it couple, the ones who didn't need to perform for others because our internal logic was supposedly enough to sustain us forever. Or so I thought, before he decided that his ego and need for validation were more important than the revolutionary freedom I was offering him on a silver platter. The day he ruined everything started out perfectly normal, right up until he decided to drop a heavy, metallic cage onto our dinner table in the form of a diamond ring. He was down on one knee, looking all hopeful and traditional, which honestly felt like a personal insult to every deep conversation we'd ever had about personal autonomy and the fallacy of ownership. I didn't scream or make a scene, I simply looked him in the eye and gave him the most rational, loving explanation possible for why I couldn't accept. I told him that I loved him for eternity, but I refused to participate in the archaic, legal cage of a marriage contract. I explained that if our love was as real as he claimed, he shouldn't need a signature or a piece of jewelry to feel secure enough to stay in my life. Instead of taking a moment to process the profound respect I was showing him by being so honest, Brandon just sat there looking like I'd slapped his mother. He didn't even try to debate the merits of my logic or show me that he was capable of growing beyond these basic, pre-packaged social scripts. He just kept repeating that he wanted a future, as if a future is something you buy at a jewelry store rather than something you build through mutual intellectual understanding. It was incredibly disappointing to see him crumble under the pressure of tradition when he had the chance to be part of something truly transcendent. He didn't fight for us, he didn't even try to prove that he could love me without the safety net of owning me legally. He walked away that night, claiming he couldn't be with someone who didn't share his values, which is just a polite way of saying he couldn't handle a woman who thinks for herself. For the last year, I've been the bigger person, reaching out once a month with a simple "the thinking of you" text just to keep the bridge intact while he worked through his issues. I knew he was just going through an emotional phase, and I wanted to make sure he knew the door was open for when he finally matured enough to handle a label-free life. He never replied, but I interpreted his silence as a sign of deep reflection and respect for my boundaries while he healed. It's hard for someone like him to admit that his entire worldview is based on a social fallacy, so I gave him the space to catch up to my level of awareness. I honestly felt like I was giving him the gift of time to realize how much he missed the intellectual stimulation only I could provide in his dull world. You can't just replace a connection like ours with a standard, off-the-shelf relationship, yet I kept seeing these little breadcrumbs of his new life through mutual friends. I ignored them because I knew they were just distractions, a way for him to numb the pain of not being able to meet me on my enlightened level. Every time I hit send on those monthly check-ins, I felt a sense of moral superiority because I was the one maintaining the eternal part of our agreement. He was the one who quit the journey, I was the one who stayed true to the spirit of our bond, regardless of where he was physically. Then, today, reality decided to take a turn for the absurd when I found out he isn't just dating someone else, he's actually marrying her. Her name is Claire, and from what I can see, she's exactly the type of person who finds comfort in the very cages I spent years trying to protect Brandon from. It's a complete lack of logic on his part, opting for a superficial piece of paper over a soul-deep connection that didn't require a legal contract. He's literally settling for a standard edition life because he's too scared to live the collector's edition I offered him for 3 years. It feels like a betrayal of our shared history, even though he's the one who decided that our history wasn't enough without a ring. I spent the entire afternoon analyzing how a man could go from proposing to a woman of my caliber to planning a wedding with someone like Claire in just 12 months. It's clear that he's not in love with her, he's in love with the idea of a wedding, the cake, and the social validation that comes with being a husband. He's taking the easy way out because he's too weak to fight for a relationship that actually challenges him to be better and more independent. It's pathetic, really, to see him throw away something eternal for something as fleeting as a legal status and a tax break. He's choosing a placeholder because he doesn't have the stamina to wait for me to decide that he's finally learned his lesson about commitment. What hurts the most isn't even the fact that he's with her, it's the sheer ungratefulness of it all after I spent years elevating his mind. I gave him 3 years of my life, my best ideas, and a version of love that most people can't even comprehend, and he treats it like it was some sort of failure. He's acting like I'm the one who did something wrong just because I wouldn't let him put me in a box with a bow on it. The way people are congratulating him on social media is nauseating, as if getting married is some sort of accomplishment rather than a surrender to the status quo. They don't see that he's just running away from the only woman who actually saw him for the person he could be. I'm sitting here looking at his wedding announcement, and I can't help but feel sorry for both of them because they are living a lie. Claire is walking into a trap with a man who clearly has unfinished business with his soulmate, and Brandon is lying to himself every time he looks at her. He's trying to prove a point to me, trying to show me that he can find someone else to play house with, but we both know the truth deep down. He's marrying a yes woman because the no woman was too much for his fragile ego and his traditional upbringing to handle. It's a classic case of someone choosing comfort over greatness, and it's honestly just sad to watch him settle for so little. He's going to realize his mistake, probably right as they're saying their vows, but by then it will be too late to admit I was right all along. I'm still here, standing by my principles and my logic, while he's out there buying into a fantasy that has a 50% divorce rate anyway. If he thinks this wedding is going to stop me from caring about his spiritual well-being, he's even more deluded than I thought possible. He can have his party and his paper, but he'll never have the kind of love I gave him, the kind that doesn't need to be told it exists. He's just another man who chose the cage because he was too afraid of the open sky I offered him. Main story comments. Anonymous user 1 says, you didn't give him a freedom or eternal love, you gave him a no when he asked for a future. He wanted a partner who was actually willing to build a life with him, not a philosophical debate partner who refuses to commit to anything real. OP's reply, you clearly don't understand the difference between attachment and true love. A future isn't a legal document, it's a shared state of being that I was perfectly willing to provide without the government's permission or a shiny rock. Anonymous user 2 says, sending monthly texts to a man who hasn't replied in a year isn't keeping a door open, it's straight up harassment and obsession. Let the man get married in peace and stop trying to enlighten someone who has clearly moved on from you. OP's reply, checking in is a sign of emotional intelligence and consistency, not harassment. I was simply honoring the for life part of our connection, which he clearly lacks the maturity to acknowledge right now because he's distracted by wedding cake. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since my last update, and the sheer lack of rationality in Brandon's life has reached a boiling point that I simply couldn't ignore any longer. After spending several nights reviewing our old messages and comparing them to the generic, filtered, happy couple photos he's been posting, I decided that as his true soulmate, it was my responsibility to provide him with some much-needed clarity. I sat down and drafted a comprehensive, well-structured email that laid out exactly why his current trajectory is a disaster waiting to happen for everyone involved. I didn't use emotional fluff or begging, I used facts, logic, and even a few bullet points to demonstrate that Claire is nothing more than a rebound of convenience, meant to fill the void I left behind. I needed him to see the logical fallacy of trying to replace a unique, high-level bond with a standard social construct just because he's impatient and insecure. In the email, I pointed out that his upcoming marriage is essentially a business transaction for a tax break and a fancy party, which is a massive step down from the intellectual partnership we shared. I told him quite clearly that I am still here, waiting for him to stop this childish tantrum and realize that he's throwing his life away for a wedding cake and a social label. I figured that once he saw my arguments laid out so clearly in black and white, he would have no choice but to admit that he's just settling because he's scared of being alone. It was a gesture of extreme kindness and intellectual honesty on my part, offering him a way out before he makes a legal mistake that will haunt him for the rest of his life. I even offered to meet for coffee, no labels, no pressure, just to help him navigate his obvious confusion before the big day. I spent hours perfecting the tone of that email, ensuring it sounded clinical yet deeply concerned for his future happiness and mental health. I explained that his desire for a contract was actually a symptom of his own insecurity and that Claire was just enabling his regression into traditionalism. I highlighted how our past conversations about autonomy were the pinnacle of his personal growth, and by marrying Claire, he was essentially deleting all the progress he made while he was with me. I felt like a mentor trying to save a star pupil from joining a cult. That's how distorted his current reality seems from the outside. I hit send with a sense of relief, knowing I had done everything in my power to bring him back to the light of logic. Instead of a thoughtful, appreciative reply from the man I've supported for years, I received a hostile message from his sister, Sarah, who has always been a bit of a drama queen. She had the audacity to tell me to leave them alone, and claimed that I was being delusional for thinking Brandon still wanted anything to do with my crazy theories. It's truly sad how his family is fueling his delusions instead of helping him see the truth. They're so obsessed with the idea of a wedding that they're willing to let him marry a placeholder. Sarah has always been threatened by my intellectual depth and my refusal to follow her boring little social rules, so it doesn't surprise me that she's taking this opportunity to try and push me out of the picture. She thinks she's protecting him, but she's actually just helping him build a prison for his own soul while she cheers from the sidelines. I didn't even bother replying to her because you can't argue with someone who operates entirely on emotion and team loyalty rather than objective truth. It's clear that the entire family has created this echo chamber where my name is forbidden, probably because my existence reminds them of how mediocre their own lives are. They want the big white wedding and the photos for Instagram, and they don't care if Brandon has to lobotomize his own spirit to get there. It's a tragic waste of potential, and honestly, it's frustrating to be the only person who actually cares about his long-term happiness enough to tell him the hard truths. They're all just cheering as he walks toward a cliff, simply because they like the way the cliff looks in the background of their family pictures. I spent the rest of the week reflecting on how difficult it is to be the voice of reason in a world that thrives on superficiality and easy answers. I sent the email because I believe in the truth, and if Brandon chooses to ignore it because his sister told him to, that's his cross to bear, not mine. I've done my part as his eternal partner to warn him of the dangers of his own ego and the trap he's setting for himself. It's not my fault if he's too weak to listen to the one person who actually knows him better than he knows himself. I'll keep my head held high, knowing that I acted with integrity and logic while everyone else is busy playing dress-up for a ceremony that means absolutely nothing. Update 1 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, you sent a bullet-pointed email explaining why his fiancé is of rebound and of illogical fallacy? You sound like you're writing a business proposal for a merger he already rejected 3 times. This isn't a clarity, it's a terrifying lack of boundaries and a massive ego trip. OP's reply, clarity is often mistaken for narcissism by those who lack it. If providing a logical framework for a major life decision is businesslike, then perhaps more people should run their lives like a successful business instead of a low-budget soap opera filled with bad decisions. Anonymous user 2 says, listen to the sister, Diane. When the family tells you to stay away, it's because you're the villain in their story, not the soulmate who was left behind. You are making their wedding preparations a nightmare with your constant unwanted interventions. OP's reply, she's always been intimidated by my intellectual depth and my refusal to follow her boring little social rules. Her opinion is based on a need for conformity and family peace, not a genuine understanding of Brandon's long-term spiritual needs. Update 2. It's been 10 days since my last update, and I finally had the opportunity to confront this absurdity in person, though it didn't go exactly as a rational person would expect. I found out through a mutual acquaintance who clearly knows that I'm the only one with any common sense left in this social circle that Brandon and Claire were having a pre-wedding brunch at a public park right near my house. It felt like a sign from the universe that I was meant to intervene one last time before he officially signed away his freedom and his dignity. I decided to go, not to cause a scene or be that ex, but to offer Brandon one final, dignified chance to be a rational human being in a room full of puppets. I spent nearly 2 hours picking out the perfect outfit, something elegantly casual that screamed, I'm doing great and I don't need a ring to prove it, just to ensure he could see exactly what he was giving up for Claire's basic aesthetic. When I arrived at the park, I spotted their group at a long table covered in overpriced mimosas and floral arrangements that looked like they belonged at a funeral for someone's personality. I walked up calmly, maintaining my composure while everyone else at the table suddenly went silent, as if they were afraid of hearing the truth from someone who isn't on the payroll. Claire looked completely confused, which isn't surprising considering she probably hasn't had a deep or original thought in her entire life. I ignored her completely and focused my attention on Brandon, speaking in a voice that was firm but full of the grace only someone with my level of self-awareness could possess. I told him that I forgave him for this engagement phase, and that I was willing to let us go back to how things were if he called it off right now and came home to reality. The reaction I got was, quite frankly, a masterclass in emotional repression and psychological projection from a man who is clearly suffering. Brandon didn't even have the decency to stand up and address me like a man who once claimed to love me for life and valued my opinion above all others. Instead, he just sat there and looked at me with this expression of pure, unadulterated pity, as if I was the one who was losing my mind. It was so incredibly patronizing. He was clearly using that look to mask his internal conflict because he knew Claire and his judgmental friends were watching his every move. He didn't say a single word for what felt like an eternity, and the silence from the rest of the table was just a testament to how uncomfortable people get when they're confronted with a truth they can't handle. I could see the gears turning in his head, the way he was desperately trying to stay in character for his new audience while his soul was probably screaming for a way out of this brunch. He didn't even try to defend his choice or explain why he was doing this to himself. he just looked at me like I was a stranger he felt sorry for. It was a complete betrayal of the 3 years we spent building a shared language and a shared logic that was supposed to be unbreakable. To be looked at with pity by a man who is literally about to enter a legal contract for his own domestic servitude is the height of irony. He thinks he's the one moving on, but he's really just moving into a smaller, darker room and pretending the view is better because it has white curtains. Eventually, one of his groomsmen, some guy named Mark who always had a secret crush on me back in the day, tried to stand up and usher me away from the table. I stood my ground for a moment longer, waiting for Brandon to show even a flicker of the man I used to know, but he just turned back to Claire and took her hand. It was such a cheap, performative gesture that it made me want to laugh right there in front of his entire family. He's so committed to the bit that he's willing to humiliate the only woman who ever truly challenged him to be more than a social statistic. I walked away with my head high, knowing that I had offered him a lifeline and he was too stubborn and scared to take it. I spent the walk home reflecting on how pity is just a defense mechanism for people who are too weak to face their own mistakes. Brandon looking at me like that was his way of convincing himself that I was the problem, rather than the fact that he's about to marry a woman he barely knows. It's a classic psychological move to cast the person who knows you best as a crazy, so you don't have to listen to the truth they're telling you. I'm not bothered by it because I know the truth is on my side, and eventually, the mask of pity will slip and reveal the regret underneath. He can stay at the brunch and hold hands with his placeholder, but he'll be thinking about my forgiveness for the rest of the afternoon. Update 2 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, that pity look wasn't masked conflict, Diane. Pity is the final stage of moving on. He's not in character, he's genuinely concerned about your mental state and done with your drama. You showed up at his pre-wedding brunch uninvited to forgive him for getting married? That is textbook delusion. OP's reply, he was clearly masking his internal conflict because Claire was watching. He knows that if he showed even a hint of his true feelings, she'd realize she's just a backup plan, and he's not ready to lose his wedding toys yet. Anonymous user 2 says, forgiving someone for moving on after you dumped them is peak delusion. You didn't offer a lifeline, you crashed a private party to demand he leave his fiancée and come back to a relationship he already left. OP's reply, I dumped the contract, not the person. Big difference. If he's too simple-minded to separate those two things after 3 years of me explaining it, then he's the one with the problem, not me. Update 3. It's been 4 days since my last update, and the fallout from the brunch has only served to prove my point about how deeply these people are entrenched in their own social delusions. The social etiquette of that entire group was a complete disaster. They're all so focused on maintaining the happy wedding narrative that they've completely abandoned basic human decency and honesty. The most insulting part of the entire encounter was how Brandon actually introduced me to Claire when I was standing right there in front of them ready to talk. He didn't call me his former partner or the woman who shaped his entire worldview. He called me an old acquaintance from college, as if I were some random person he used to pass in the hall. An acquaintance? After 3 years of me loving him for life and sharing every intimate detail of our existence, he downgraded me to the lowest tier possible just to protect his peace of mind. It's a blatant lie, and he knows it deep down, but he's so desperate to make this wedding easier to digest that he's willing to rewrite our entire history in front of everyone. I stood my ground and tried to be the bigger person by explaining the situation to Claire, woman to woman, since she seemed so oblivious. I told her quite calmly that she needs to understand she's just a placeholder for the commitment Brandon is too scared to live without. I wanted her to know the truth so she could make an informed decision before she tied her life to a man who is clearly still obsessed with his ex. I figured she'd appreciate the heads up, but instead of thanking me for my honesty, she actually had the nerve to laugh in my face. She looked at me with this smug, condescending smile and said, I hope you find the freedom you're looking for, Diane, which was just so incredibly petty. The arrogance of that statement is absolutely astounding. She's literally celebrating her own legal confinement and acting like I'm the one who's lost. She thinks she's won because she has the ring, but she doesn't realize that she's just inherited a man who is living a lie every single day. The toxic positivity coming off of Claire is like a physical wall. She's using it to hide her own deep-seated insecurity about being the second choice for a man who couldn't have what he actually wanted. She knows she can't compete with the intellectual and spiritual intensity one brought to Brandon's life, so she's leaning into this happy bride persona to keep herself from falling apart. It's a pathetic display of weakness, and it's even worse that Brandon is playing along with it like a trained dog. They are literally celebrating their own funeral as a couple, and they're doing it with expensive champagne and fake smiles for the cameras. I've never seen two people so committed to lying to themselves and everyone around them just to fit into a social mold they didn't even design. I spent the last few days realizing that Brandon has completely lobotomized his own memory of us just to make his new life work for his family. He's choosing to remember me as some random person from his past so he doesn't have to deal with the crushing guilt of throwing away something irreplaceable. It's a coward's move, but I suppose I shouldn't be surprised given how he folded the moment I challenged his desire for a contract. He wants the easy life with the acquaintance label because the soulmate label requires too much work and too much honesty. It's a tragedy for him, really, because he's going to wake up one day in 10 years and realize he's married to a total stranger. He'll be sitting in some suburban living room, looking at Claire, and he'll finally understand that he traded a diamond of a woman for a piece of glass. I'm not even angry anymore. I'm just disappointed in the human race's ability to settle for mediocrity when greatness was right there. I've decided that their laughter is just a shield, a way to protect their fragile little fantasy from the cold hard truth I represent. They think they've won because they have a date and a venue, but I've won because I'm the only one here who isn't living a scripted lie. Claire can have her freedom of comment, and Brandon can have his acquaintance label, but neither of them will ever have the truth of what we were. They're just two actors in a very expensive, very boring play, and I'm the only one in the audience who can see the strings. I'll stay here in my reality, thanks, where love doesn't need to be performative to be real and lasting. Update 3 comments. Anonymous user 1 says, applaud Claire for that one. She didn't scream or get messy, she won with kindness and a sick burn that went right over your head. She's living her best life while you're stalking their brunch and calling yourself a soulmate to a man who literally calls you an acquaintance. OP's reply, she's just using toxic positivity to hide her insecurity. Anyone can pretend to be kind when they're hiding behind a social script. It takes real strength to be as honest as I am, even when it's uncomfortable for others. Anonymous user 2 says, he downgraded you because you're a ghost to him now, Diane. To Brandon, you aren't the one who got away, you're the mistake he finally stopped making. He's not lying to himself, he's finally telling the truth about how little you matter to his present life. OP's reply, he's just lying to himself to make the wedding easier to digest. If he truly didn't care, he wouldn't have to lie about our history to his new toy to make her feel secure. Update 4. It's been 2 days since my last update, and the farce has finally reached its inevitable, hollow conclusion yesterday. The wedding happened, a day filled with the kind of performative joy that usually masks a deep, systemic failure of the spirit and a surrender to the status quo. I spent the morning at our favorite cafe, the one where we used to sit for hours, discussing the futility of social constructs just to give Brandon a physical location for his escape. I sent him one final text during the ceremony, a gesture of ultimate grace and a final test of his supposed love for me. I told him, I'm at our favorite cafe. If you leave now, I won't even mention her name again and we can start over. I wanted to give him a clear, logical exit strategy, a way to reclaim his autonomy before the state officially took it from him with a signature. I waited there for 3 long hours, drinking cold coffee and watching the clock, fully expecting him to walk through that door with the look of a man who had finally come to his senses. I had prepared a whole speech about how we could rebuild our connection on a foundation of true freedom, without any of the labels that had caused so much friction. But 3 hours turned into 4, and the only thing I received for my patience was a notification on my phone that felt like a slap. It wasn't a text explaining his delay, and it wasn't a call to apologize for the mess he'd made of our lives. It was a total and complete block on every platform: WhatsApp, Instagram, even LinkedIn, as if he could delete me by clicking a button. He didn't even have the courage to say goodbye or argue with my final offer. He just hit a button and erased our entire history from his digital existence. My eternal love strategy was designed to keep him forever because he would never feel the suffocating pressure of a yes or no contract. I thought that by refusing to give him a conventional answer, I was making myself permanent, someone he could never truly finish with because our story was never closed. Instead, my refusal to play his game made me so completely irrelevant that he didn't even bother to respond to the most generous offer I've ever made. He didn't fight for us because, in his small, binary mind, us stopped existing the moment I chose my logic over his shiny little ring. He's opted for the ultimate label husband, and in doing so, he's made me a non-entity in his new, simplified version of reality. I sat in that cafe until they closed, realizing that my philosophy had worked perfectly, just not in the way I intended for my own life. I have all the freedom I ever wanted. I have no labels, no commitments, and no one telling me how to live my life or what to value. I am completely autonomous, a sovereign individual unburdened by the illegal cage I so despised when he was the one offering it. And yet, as I walked home alone past the park where they had their brunch, the freedom felt remarkably like being discarded by a man who simply found a more convenient truth to believe in. I'm still right, of course his marriage is a facade and his acquaintance label is a desperate lie he tells to sleep at night, but being right is a very cold comfort when you're the only person left in the room. He's married now, tied to a woman who thinks a signature is a soul, while I am still the same woman I was when I told him no, a year ago. I haven't changed, my logic hasn't failed, and my commitment to my principles remains unshaken despite the social pressure to conform. But Brandon has moved into a world where I no longer exist, a world made of paper and promises that he'll probably keep just out of spite and a need for stability. I'm sitting here with my intellectual depth and my for-life love, and he's out there living a standard, mediocre life that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It's funny how the very thing I used to protect our love, my refusal to label it, is the thing he used to justify leaving it behind like a piece of trash. I have my freedom, and he has his cage, and for some reason, the silence on my phone is the loudest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I guess some people just aren't built for the kind of greatness I was offering. They need the walls of the cage to feel like they aren't falling. I'll stay out here in the open, but it's a lot emptier than I thought it would be when I first started this journey. He made his choice, and he chose the lie, which is exactly why he never deserved the truth I was willing to give him.